All right, so welcome back. Hopefully you didn't have any trouble yesterday with the reading or the AP daily videos. My apologies for not assigning the TQ 1.3 for the appropriate time, but thank you for those of you that brought that to my attention. Let's go ahead and take a look at our checklist for the day. Nope. What do we got? All right. So, check your mic. All right. So, hopefully you got all that taken care of yesterday. And I do want to reiterate and remind you guys that if I post something like check these videos out, check these slides out, read this, you need to do it. I know that the TQ 1.3 only was 3 questions. They were really easy questions and don't necessarily address the entire breadth of the reading and the videos from yesterday, but that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for the information in the reading. As I had said before, the AP and environmental science class, the prerequisites for this class are earth and environmental and biology, right? And so you are responsible for filling those deficits. And that's why I give you these readings. And that's why, you guys are having to do some of this on your own because we don't have enough class time to go over all the biomes. That's stuff that I did when I taught earth and environmental. And so you need to go and make sure to be reading that and understanding it. If you have any questions about the readings, right, that I don't address directly in our discussions, then you need to reach out and say, hey, Mr. Collins, I was going through this reading and I just don't get this. And that's what Wednesdays are for, right? We can set up little private tutoring sessions. Hopefully you completed the TQ 1.3. I will go over that here in just a second. And then what are we doing today? We got a Zoom, all right, and we're going to look at some more questions that kind of go back over some of the important stuff from 1.3. I will go over TQ 1.2 as well as 1.3. We're going to take a look at some slides that discuss the carbon and nitrogen cycle. I'll be introducing those today. They're 2 very important biogeochemical cycles. And then you've got a reading for tonight and a TQ 1.4, which I'll be releasing here shortly. Now, tomorrow, snow. Right? And because it's going to snow and because it doesn't snow often, what I think I'm probably going to do in place of our Zoom, I'll probably assign the AP daily video for the carbon cycle as well as the nitrogen cycle as a way for you to review those because they are pretty challenging and they're definitely not something you look at once and you understand completely. You'll need some time to mull all that information over. And the reason I think I'm going to opt out of a live Zoom tomorrow is because tomorrow would be like a snow day if we were in a regular class setting. And snow is, to me, a kind of a magical display of physical chemistry. And I like the way that it kind of changes the behavior of animals and birds and squirrels and things. And so what I would like for you to do tomorrow, in place of our normal Zoom session, I want you to go outside, right? Because the snow is not going to be here forever. And I do want you to enjoy it. And I want you to go outside and observe how the change in abiotic conditions can influence the biotic components, right? The way the animals and birds and everything are behaving. So I do want you to go out and enjoy it. And that way, when the snow starts to melt, you can come back inside, warm up, dry off, and then you can watch those AP daily videos, right? It's important to me that you do spend some time outside because this is an AP environmental class. And for us to really appreciate and understand the environment, we need to spend some more time in it. All right. So when you wake up in the morning, I'll have probably made an announcement via the Google Classroom and Remind, kind of filling you in on how tomorrow might change as a result of the snow, right? Now, there'll still be the reading. You still need to get that done. You'll still need to complete the TQ 1.5. But first and foremost, I want you to get out in the morning and enjoy the snow. All right. Okay. So let's take a look at our actually, before we get to the warm-up, I want to thank those of you guys that already went ahead and posted or selected a bird for your research. I do want to show you guys this project outline right here. I put together this to kind of help guide your research. It also kind of outlines my expectations, right? And you can see here that there are different categories, things that I want you to look for. The reason I put examples here is you're not limited to just these things, okay? I do want you to exercise some creativity and express some of your own personal interest. However, there are some things that are absolutely required of you. And one of those is a way in which you've organized or the way you will present your information, your research. And there are lots of different ways that you can collect this information and present it to the class. Okay. Our research won't be due until next Friday, and we won't be presenting or sharing our projects until the following Tuesday. So not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that. I can't remember the exact date. It'd probably be like what, 16, 17, 18, the 19th of January, something like that. And we'll be sharing our research via breakout groups. Now, if you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not good at presentations, that's fine. That's why I offer these opportunities. Like you can make a YouTube video with you and your partner, or you by yourself, or you can do it like podcast style, right? So, you could just record an audio stream, right? You can kind of write out your information and you would just share it and record it via podcast. And that way, when we share our information, you could simply say, here, listen to this, or here, check out this video. Our presentations, you need to keep it nice and short and concise. Think like an elevator pitch, 3 to 5 minutes tops. Now, there are some like other components that I need in this research, and that's your references, your works cited page. Now, I know a lot of you guys have never really done formal research yet, so you probably don't know how to properly cite resources in a works cited page or a resource or a source list. So what I want to start with is just a simple list of the websites, books, journals, wherever you get your information, you need to include that in your list of references. As the semester progresses, I'll teach you how to more formally present your sources and your references. And this is how I'll be evaluating your work, right? I have split it into 10 categories and there'll be 10 points each, right? And so you're like, okay, introduction, how am I going to make sure to get those 10 points? I'm going to make sure to address the things that I've outlined here, but you're not just limited to these as well. And so I will be grading it with a rubric, which I have included up here, right? This project final draft. This is where you will submit your final work once you've completed it. And again, that's January 15th. That's next Friday, 11:59. And this is the rubric, right? So this is how I'll grade it, right? So I'll look at your introduction and I'll say, okay, exceeds expectations, meets, met most, met some, or met none, right? And so it'll be a 10 point system for each of the 10 categories for a total of 100. Okay. So I just wanted to give you a heads up there. So that way, you could start your research today or tomorrow if you wanted to. Maybe, you got some downtime over the weekend and you and your partner wanted to get ahead instead of behind. It's entirely up to you, but that is due next Friday. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some warm-up questions. I would like for you guys to take the next 5 minutes and just quickly scan through these questions and ask yourself, do I know the answer? All right, you can write it down. And again, I don't do study guides for quizzes or exams because this is our living, breathing study guide. So you might want to take pictures of these or take a screenshot. All right, so 5 minutes go. Let me set my timer. Okay, got it. 2 more minutes. Alrighty. And like I said, for these first couple warm-ups, I'll be doing the talking, but as we progress through the semester, I will be calling on you guys to share your answers. So let's look at number 2. What two aspects of an area are considered when classifying a biome? Well, if you think about some famous biomes like a tropical rainforest, it's like a two-part name, right? And so it's classified by both its climate, in this case tropical, and the biological communities, rainforest. And what does that mean? It's a forest that's well adapted for a lot of rain, right? So those adaptations be shared among the plants and animals. So if you think about a temperate deciduous forest, temperate again is the climate, deciduous forest being the predominant biological communities, animals that are well adapted for a deciduous forest. And then the plants being deciduous in that they drop their leaves in the fall and kind of hibernate over the winter. If you think about a uh, polar grassland, aka a tundra, right? Tundra is kind of like a shortened name, but it really means polar grassland, polar being the climate, and then grassland being the predominant biological communities. Now, what exactly determines the climate? Well, climates can be affected by geographical features and conditions, right? So the two things that I think about first, if I'm trying to approximate or figure out or hypothesize what the climate might be like of an area, is how far is it from the equator, right? So what is the latitude, right? So the closer you are to the equator, generally speaking, it's going to be warmer, right? If you're right by the equator, more likely it's going to be tropical. As you move further away and you cross the 30 degrees north latitude, you're going to move into temperate and then eventually more towards a polar climate. But altitude can also determine climate, right? So you might be really close to the equator, but you're at a higher altitude, right, or higher elevation. That can influence climate. So if you think about the Himalayan mountains, right, the Himalayan mountains are not that far off from the equator, or even some of the mountains in Ethiopia or Kenya in Africa are really close to the equator. They have different climates because of altitude. So latitude and altitude can influence the climate, and also geographical features, right? So the Himalayan mountains themselves influence regional climates because they can create rain shadows and they can, affect prevailing uh, air masses and things like that. So mountain ranges can influence climate in nearby areas as well as bodies of water, right? So areas that are close to large bodies of water, the areas in and around the Great Lakes, their climate is influenced by those lakes, believe it or not. How close or how far you are away from the ocean can also influence climates, right? So, generally speaking, places that are closer to oceans have a more stable climate per se. And I know it's kind of like counterintuitive. You're like, what? What about like tropical storms? But the closer you are to the ocean, the more moderated, if you will, or regulated the temperatures are, right? If you think about island nations and countries, especially ones that are really, really small islands, like the islands of Hawaii or even the Florida Keys, the temperature fluctuations are not that great because the water around it acts as like a thermal mass. Um, Whereas the further you are from the ocean, the more dynamic the temperature changes can be. If you think about a state like Kansas, right, really landlocked, it'll be blistering hot in the summer and then freezing cold in the winter, and that's because of the uh, distance from oceans. All right, and then you also see that in places like Kazakhstan. I think Kazakhstan is the most landlocked country on planet Earth. So it's thousands of miles from the closest ocean. They have some pretty wild climatic swings out there, especially as the Aral Sea dries up. Plants, animals, and organisms found in the same biome will all have unique blank that increase their likelihood of surviving and reproducing. Well, plants and animals and organisms are all going to have adaptations that are unique to the particular biome that they exist in. Now, some organisms are more highly specialized for a biome, so they're going to have a greater degree of unique characteristics that match that biome. And there are some generalist species out there, like a raccoon, which you could find in many different biomes, right? But most organisms, they match their biomes pretty well. And that's not just they sat down and said, you know what I really need right now living in a tundra? I need white fur. No, it's the result of genetic mutations and selective pressures on populations over thousands or millions of years. But believe it or not, natural selection has actually modified quite a few species within the observable time period. In fact, um, the the popularity of bird feeding and bird feeders in parts of Europe have significantly influenced the migratory patterns of birds, and we're seeing the emergence of subspecies as a result of the human-bird interaction, right? Um, Number four, what are the four major ocean zones determined by both depth and distance? And looking back at it, I really should have rewritten this question to be a little bit more specific. So let's first think about just distance from shore, right? So if I'm going to draw like a little, you know, shoreline right to the ocean, we have the beach, right? This area right here, okay, right where the ocean meets land. This is the intertidal zone, and the intertidal zone is a very dynamic marine biome, right? High tide, low tide. So the plants and animals and organisms that live in the intertidal zone have a wide range of tolerance. They can tolerate fluctuations in temperature. 1 minute they're underwater, the next minute they're exposed to the hot beating sun, and they have tolerance for salinity and changes in pH. These guys are gnarly, tough little buggers that live in the intertidal zones. If you move a little further away to a depth of, maybe 200 meters or less, and you're thinking 200 meters, wow, that's like 600 feet. In the grand scheme of things, that's still pretty shallow for an ocean. That's the neritic zone, right, or near shore environment. You move out a little further, right? You pass the continental shelf. Now we're talking about thousands of feet in depth. We're now in the open ocean, also known as the pelagic zone, right? And then all along the bottom is referred to as the benthic zone. And the benthic zone is where we actually find most of our marine organisms, right? They like to live at the bottom. And if you think about near shore neritic environments like coral reefs or seagrasses, the seagrasses, right? They're producers, they're going to be on the bottom. And so the things that eat the grasses are going to be at the bottom, and they're going to attract, higher trophic level consumers. Coral reefs are going to be on the bottom as well. And then if you get down into the deep ocean, that's where you're going to find your hydrothermal vents and those crazy chemosynthetic bacteria. How you going to remember this? I need peanut butter. I don't know. That works for me. I learned this long time ago. And you can also break down ocean zones or marine ecosystems. And this is like oceanography 101 by the ability of light to penetrate depth, right? So the area that light can penetrate is known as the photic zone, right? And so you're going to find a lot of photosynthetic organisms here, whether they are the photosynthetic seagrasses, the photosynthetic zooxanthellae found in the gastrodermis of your coral cnidarians, or in the phytoplankton that we find floating around the surface of the ocean, right? And they need sunlight, right? So that's going to be in the photic zone. You get down a little deeper, you're going to get into the aphotic zone, right? So no photosynthesis is taking place down here because there's no sunlight, right? All the sunlight, all the electromagnetic radiation had been absorbed by the ocean at this point, right? So no photosynthesis down here. But for a long time, right? And believe it or not, when your grandparents were in school, they probably learned that there probably wasn't life at the bottom of the ocean, right? It wasn't until like the 40s and 50s with like sonar and new imaging systems that we realized that holy smokes, there's life at the bottom of the ocean. We used to think it was just nothingness. That's why we actually named the bottom of the ocean the abyssal zone, right? Because we talk about nothingness as like the great abyss. Well, we found these hydrothermal vents where like hydrogen sulfides bubbling up, and there's these bacteria that can use that to create sugar. And then there's life down there, right? And that's aphotics. These organisms don't rely on a photosynthetic supported food web. And we'll talk more about that later. Um, so yeah, we'll just break that down. And it's important to kind of understand this because, the environmental issues that we experience or see in the intertidal zone is going to be different than the pelagic zone. And so it's important to understand those terms. Now, what forms coral reefs, right? So coral reefs, they form in deep water, but a lot of them form in shallower water. And, they create those like rocky structures we know as reefs. Well, the coral reef is actually created by coral. And believe it or not, coral are animals, and they belong to the group Cnidaria, which also includes jellyfish, right? So they're kind of like upside down jellyfish, right? And they've got their little stinging tentacles that they use to filter feed, right? And so they've got the little gastrodermis, and it's kind of crazy. Their mouth and their anus are the same opening. Aren't you glad that you're a human and not a coral? And they secrete this calcium carbonate exoskeleton, right? So the tiny little coral secretes its own little exoskeleton. And eventually, like all organisms, the coral will grow, develop, and die. And when it dies, it leaves behind that calcium carbonate skeleton. And then the next coral animal will come along and attach itself and grow, and it'll secrete its own skeleton. And so over thousands and millions of years, these reefs are constructed from the dead remains of these corals, right? In fact, Florida, a majority of Florida is calcium carbonate. It's a type of rock known as limestone. That's the ancient remains of a coral reef, right? Because sea levels change throughout geological time, and at one point Florida was underwater, and it's the ancient remains of a reef. I don't know, I think that's kind of neat. Now, what ecological services do these coral reefs provide? Well, as these coral reefs get bigger and bigger and bigger, right, underwater, they create these large masses, right? And this can create habitat, right, spaces for other animals and organisms to live. And so you've got this entire ecosystem supported by corals. And corals actually have the highest biodiversity of all marine ecosystems. But they also provide a lot of services for the intertidal and the land area, because when hurricanes and other storms roll in, right, they create a lot of wave action, right? And waves are just cyclical movements of water, right? And they contain a lot of energy, being powered by wind. And as the wave energy gets towards the reef, right, the water has nowhere to go but up. And so the energy creates a wave, and the wave crashes. And as it crashes, it loses steam, or like kind of loses energy. And so coral reefs act as a barrier, right? They dissipate storm energy and preserve shorelines, right? And you'll come to realize that estuaries, which are really important kind of intertidal zones meets the river, are really important nursery ecosystems for fish. They're also important for terrestrial ecosystems. And those estuaries are protected by reefs. Think about the Great Barrier Reef. Why do you think we call it that? Because it protects the coastline of Australia from incoming storms. How do wetlands differ from lakes and ponds? Well, you think about a lake and a pond, right? You got all the plants along the outside, right? And then you got nice deep water, right? Well, a wetland is an area of land that is like partially inundated with water, right? So the water table, more or less, is right at the surface. And at some point, some wetlands actually dry out seasonally, and then they fill back up. Famous wetland that comes to mind is the Okavango in Africa. There are periods of time where it actually dries up, and then the rains come and it fills back up. And it's just kind of determined by the plants, right? So you don't really have like a tree growing in the middle of a lake, but you will find trees growing in the middle of swamps, which are types of wetlands. You'll have grasses growing up out of the water in marshes. You don't find a lot of plants in bogs, which is a type of wetland because of the pH. They're really acidic. They tend to be anaerobic, so things don't break down very quickly, right? So wetlands are kind of like a hybrid. It's like aquatic ecosystem meets terrestrial ecosystem. And they are really important because as water goes into a wetland, something happens while it resides in the wetland, and then when it leaves, it's different. Wetlands tend to filter water. They're kind of like nature's purification system. So when water enters a wetland, maybe it's been flowing in a river, across a continent, and as it flows, it's going to gather a lot of nutrients and contaminants. Things are going to dissolve in the water. It rains, things flow into the rivers, and all these contaminants and all these nutrients are actually removed in wetlands. And so when the water leaves the wetland, it's actually cleaner, quote unquote, or quote, cleaner, end quote, than it was before it entered. And so wetlands are really, really important ecosystems. And we actually use our understanding of how wetlands work to purify our own water, right, for drinking. And that's also how we process we use to treat wastewater. Unfortunately, we do some things that damage or degrade or compromise wetlands and their ability to actually purify water. And that's problematic. In fact, a lot of major cities are built on top of wetlands. San Francisco, Miami, New York City, believe it or not, is built on top of wetland. And that inhibits the wetland's ability to purify water. And that's why you should never swim in any water in and around New York City. I don't even know why people go to New York City. I mean, it's good to go once and realize how disgusting it is and then never go back again. All right. 8. What percent of Earth's water is saline or salt? Anyone? How much of the water on planet Earth is salty? We can't drink it. Cue cricket noise.
97.5.
Yeah. So, wait, where'd my little pen go? Yeah, definitely. Like around 97%, right? And so a vast majority of the water on planet Earth is saline or salty. And the salinity, or the average salinity of most salt water, is only 3%. So salt water is really not all that salty, right? 97% of the water on planet Earth is salty. And if you actually take an average sample of salt water, it'll have a salinity of about 3%. That means 3% salt, 97% water. Some places like the Dead Sea, the salinity can be as high as 30%. And so the remaining percent of water on planet Earth, that remaining 3%, is fresh water, right? And that's important, right, for animals, especially us. Now, where is a majority of this fresh water?
Ice caps and glaciers.
Yeah, ice caps and glaciers, right? So a majority of the fresh water is frozen, right? And that kind of stinks. It's actually really important, and I'll talk about why ice caps and glaciers are so important, but we can't use them really for drinking. And then another large percent of the water is in groundwater, right? And then the small, tiny little fraction that is available to us is available as surface water, right? So we do need to take care of these freshwater ecosystems. We do need to take care of fresh water because we only have a fraction of a fraction of a fraction available for use. Now, does anyone know what a riparian zone is? Anyone take a guess? And why they might be important? It's kind of a weird word. I like it. Anybody? Okay, well, a riparian zone is the little zone that surrounds lakes, streams, wetlands, but we use it more around rivers, right? And so that little strip of vegetation that grows right along the riverbank or the river's edge is known as the riparian zone. And the riparian zone is really important because it acts as a buffer. So as surface water flows across the ground, it's going to be picking up dissolved nutrients, contaminated maybe heavy metals or sediments. And the riparian zone acts as a buffer because when that surface water flows down the hill, hits those plants, the plants will remove a lot of the nutrients, will slow the flow of runoff so that maybe some of the sediments will settle, and that can kind of keep the rivers and streams, the nutrient concentrations lower, and they can also prevent the sediment from getting in the rivers, which would increase the turbidity. So they kind of keep the rivers and streams clean. Unfortunately, when people buy property along a river, say like Judges, they want to be able to see the river from where they're at. So what do? They cut down all the riparian vegetation, and that removes valuable habitat for things like amphibians. And we'll realize how important amphibians are as we progress through the semester. And they also remove those important vegetation, right? So when it rains on the parking lot of Judges, any of the oil or antifreeze or chemicals that may have leaked out of the car will wash straight down into the Catawba without being slowed down or removed by the riparian vegetation. So we'll talk a lot about riparian vegetation and riparian zones as we kind of chug along. All right, so clear that up. And let me exit out of this. We'll quickly, this time is, I gotta sign in real quick. I want to quickly go over 1.2 and 1.3, our TQs, just to make sure we know what the correct answer is. This time is just flowing by. No, I need to go here. No, that's not what I want to do. I had everything pulled up, but of course it timed out. There we go. My apologies too for the delay yesterday with the TQs. All right, so 1.2, the biome that contains plants that are adapted to prevent water loss. We're talking about plants that need to deal with maybe long periods of drought. That would be a desert. There are lots of kinds of deserts. So you have polar deserts and temperate deserts like you find here in America, and then tropical deserts like you find in the Sahara. Long dry seasons with grazing animals and the predominant vegetation being grasses. So it'd be like a tropical grassland like a savanna. A temperate grassland would be like a prairie like we have here in America. Warm and wet, we're talking about some kind of tropical rainforest here, and they have very, very consistent temperatures and very consistent amount of precipitation. Believe it or not, a vast majority of the rain that falls in a tropical rainforest is the result of the trees themselves pulling water up, evapotranspiration, and raining back down. So it's like a neat little closed system. So you move the trees, you move the water. All right, let's look at 1.3, our aquatic biomes. Which of the following statements is true about aquatic biomes? Freshwater biomes are vital sources of drinking water, right? These wetlands, these streams, these lakes, and these ponds are essential for our survival and for many other animals as well, because there's so little freshwater available. Areas that have a narrow band along the coast that experience an incredible range in temperature and sunlight and pH and salinity, those will be intertidal zones. Really, really crazy places for organisms to survive. And then where is a majority of the freshwater? And ice caps and glaciers. All right, don't forget, you've got TQ 1.4 tonight, and let's go ahead and start our lesson. So let's talk about the carbon cycle, and I'm just going to introduce this. Tomorrow I will be sharing the 1.4 video and 1.5 video for carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle for you to go back over this, and then the readings that I'm assigning today and tomorrow will go into greater detail. So don't think like, if you're listening and watching, you're like, oh my God, this is a lot. You're not doomed. You just got to give it a second. Okay. There's a lot of information to take in. So what are biogeochemical cycles? Well, they are cycles, right, that exist on planet Earth that move various elements of significant importance between the biosphere, the geosphere, hence the name biogeo, as well as the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. So carbon gets cycled through a lot of different processes, and it gets stored in some places and held for a long period of time, or in other places it gets stored and held for a shorter period of time. And so here are some of the various processes that move carbon from one sphere to the next. Some of these processes are fairly quick, right? Like photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis occurs daily, and some plants only live for a particular season. So they'll remove carbon from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. They'll make carbohydrates, sugars that they might be using for growing. And that carbon might end up back in the atmosphere within a couple of hours, or maybe even just a day or two. Whereas some of the other carbon molecules that are photosynthesized into carbohydrates will be used to form things like cellulose. And cellulose is what plants use to make their cell wall. And so they make more cells through cell division to get bigger, right? So plants grow by accumulating carbon. And so some plants live for, a season. Some plants live for decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years. And so however long the plant lives is how long that carbon might be stored there in the cellulose or lignin. Now, even if a plant lives 1,000 years, that's still a blink of an eye in terms of a geological timescale. So the carbon that cycles through the biosphere is like really quick and really short term, right? So the plant makes the sugar, we eat the plant, and we exhale the carbon dioxide. That's hours, years, thousands of years. It's still a really, really short term process. Now, there are other situations, right, where carbon can be trapped in the geosphere and trapped as rocks or fossil fuels. And in that case, that's a really slow process. Generally, any process involving geology, for the most part, is going to take a long time. Rocks form over thousands or millions of years, and it can be millions of years before those rocks or that trapped carbon can be brought back to the surface to kind of be introduced back into the hydrosphere or atmosphere or biosphere. Oceans, believe it or not, participate in a lot of gas exchange, right? So carbon dioxide can dissolve into the oceans. And then because of surface turbulence like waves and wind, some of the carbon dioxide will actually fall out of dissolution or even change in temperature. You think about a cup of soda, right? The warmer it gets, the less likely it is to hold on to the carbon dioxide. Yeah, soda has carbon dioxide in it, so they call it a carbonated beverage. Now, plants, through respiration, every time I exhale, I'm releasing carbon dioxide from the sugars that I'm breaking down. So believe it or not, you actually lose weight every time you exhale. And that's why exercising causes us to lose weight, because we're breathing more. And the more you breathe, the more carbon dioxide you release. And every time you urinate and defecate, or expel a flatulent, which is the scientific term for a fart, you're going to release carbon-containing gases. Yes, so every time you toot, you are releasing some carbon dioxide and maybe even some methane, which is why it sometimes kind of smells. Now, certain animals fart or excrete more waste than others, and so later on in the semester, we're going to talk about some issues with cattle and their farts because they release a lot of methane. And methane and carbon dioxide are both greenhouse gases. Speaking of greenhouse gases, some of the ancient carbon trapped beneath the earth, we bring to the surface and we use it for energy, right? Fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and oil. Well, coal, natural gas, and oil are all the fossilized remains of plants, believe it or not. Certain ecosystems like wetlands, specifically peat bogs, accumulate a lot of organic matter, and over time it gets buried and becomes rocks, which would be coal, or it could be gaseous, natural gas, or liquid form, which would be oil. And the carbohydrates that become fossilized still contain a lot of the energy that they did when they were first formed. And so when we burn it or combust it, we release those gases into the atmosphere. Wildfires, whether they're of natural origin or anthropogenic, anytime you see that word anthropogenic, that means related to people. So whether the fire started from a lightning strike or somebody throwing a cigarette out the window, they release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere as well. Now let's take a look at where carbon is stored and which of these processes is contributing to these various sinks or reservoirs. A sink or reservoir simply means where this particular element is stored. And so you can see those here in blue, right? The bigger the number, the more carbon stored. So looking at this diagram, you realize, holy smokes, there is a tremendous amount of carbon in the geosphere, right? The soils, the Earth's crust, which would be like rocks, sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic, and our fossil fuels. Now, these numbers are actually in petagrams or petagrams, and one petagram or petagram, 1 pg, is the equivalent of 1 billion tons. So there is a lot of carbon trapped in rocks and soils and fossil fuels. The next largest reservoir or sink is the ocean, right? So the ocean does contain a tremendous amount of carbon, and I will get to the various forms of carbon here in just a second. And then you can see that the remainder is kind of split between the atmosphere and plants, right? So although we talk a lot about greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane and conversations about the environment, there's really not that much carbon in the atmosphere, which kind of everything, right? All the plants and animals are well adapted to a low concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. So changing this small concentration can have significant impacts. Now, the red things that you see here are all different fluxes, flows, or processes that exchange or that allow these different spheres to interact. So the hydrosphere, the oceans, can interact with the atmosphere through dissolution and the absorption of carbon dioxide. So the more carbon dioxide we pump into the atmosphere, the more likely it is, because of an increase in partial pressure, to be dissolved into the ocean. And this can be problematic. One of the major problems with excess carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean is known as ocean acidification, right? The more carbon dioxide that bubbles into the ocean, the more carbonic acid we form, and this actually inhibits the formation of calcium carbonate skeletons. So all the marine organisms that need to make shells or little exoskeletons, like our corals that we were talking about earlier, are affected by this excess carbon dioxide ending up in the ocean. And it's kind of crazy too, because oceans naturally have, whoa, that's colored, it's not good. Oceans naturally have a slightly basic pH. I have pH of 8. And as more carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean, the pH is slowly moving towards 7. And you might be thinking, well, why would that be a problem? 7 is neutral, like pure water. Well, neutral solutions don't make for good environments for marine organisms to form their exoskeletons, right? So as the ocean becomes slightly more acidic, not really acidic, moving towards neutral, these organisms are having a harder time forming their shells, right? And this is not good, because phytoplankton create these tiny little microscopic shells to protect them. And if they can't do that, they're phytoplanktons, they're like the foundation of the marine ecosystem, right? So if they can't survive as producers, then that's going to mean a lot of trouble for the consumers. Now, some of that carbon that is retained in those shells and those exoskeletons and the biomass of marine organisms, when they die, that carbon sinks to the bottom, and through a process known as lithification, right, it gets buried to sediments, it becomes rocks, right? And a lot of times the sediments and soils in oceans, when it comes compressed through lithification, it forms a type of rock known as limestone. And limestone has a high concentration of calcium, carbonate, I think it's CO3. No, all you need to know is it's got a lot of calcium and a lot of carbon in there, right? And so the limestone will be trapped, or the carbon will be trapped in the limestone for potentially thousands, millions, maybe even billions of years, right? And what's kind of neat about this is anywhere you find limestone, you can kind of assume that at one point there may have been an ocean above it. Again, limestone, there's tons of it in Florida, right? So you know that Florida was at one point under the ocean. You can also find lots of limestone in places like Arizona, which you're like, wait a minute, what is that? If there's limestone there, was it underwater? Yeah, it was actually, believe it or not, a couple times throughout geological history. You know, where Arizona is today would have been under an ancient sea, right? Now, when carbon gets trapped, how does it get back to the surface? Well, geological uplift can push the rocks to the surface, and they can weather and erode back into soils, and then the plants can have access. Bacteria can have access to the carbon, and they can use it for photosynthesis, or just break it down and release it back into the atmosphere. Or we bring it to the surface, right? Fossil fuels, we burn it, and that releases a lot of carbon dioxide and methane or methane into the air. So yeah. The biosphere aspect of the carbon cycle is fast, and the geological aspect of the carbon cycle is slow, okay? All right, we gotta move on, because we still gotta talk about the nitrogen cycle. All right, now don't get a nosebleed, don't panic. I know this looks crazy, but again, we're gonna look at this over and over and over again, and we're gonna look at different diagrams, and we're gonna break down the vocabulary. So first and foremost, what in the world are we dealing with here? Well, nitrogen is really, really important. Nitrogen is a significant limiting factor for most ecosystems, right? So most plants are just sitting around waiting for nitrogen. It's the primary component in most fertilizers. But there's tons of nitrogen, right? In fact, 78% of our atmosphere is made up of what is known as diatomic nitrogen. The only problem with diatomic nitrogen is it's chemically inert. In other words, when I breathe in air and I exhale, the nitrogen goes in and it goes out. It's not chemically reactive. These nitrogens are held together really, really well. Diatomic, di meaning two, atomic, talking about two atoms. two atoms of nitrogen, they form triple bonds. So these guys really like each other. So to get them to dance with any other element or to separate them, it takes a lot of energy. And so plants need the nitrogen, but most plants, actually all plants, don't have a way of getting to that nitrogen. So the atmospheric nitrogen first needs to be fixed. Okay, it needs to be changed into a form that plants can use. And then once plants can get a hold of it, then we can eat it. And we need nitrogen because nitrogen is an essential component of proteins and nucleic acids, right? Nucleic acids are what, we make DNA out of and RNA. Are really important. Now, some plants have mutualistic relationships. Hey, there's our vocab word again, with certain bacteria that live in what are known as root nodules. Hopefully, if we can get back in the classroom and you guys return, we're working in the school garden, we'll actually plant some legumes. Legumes are plants that have adaptations that create these little bubbles, and they're like bacteria houses. And symbiotic bacteria will live in these root nodules, and these bacteria have awesome enzymes. These enzymes are strong enough to break this triple bond, and they can create forms of nitrogen that the plant need. The plant can then assimilate those nitrogen compounds into amino acids to make proteins and DNA, and the plant will grow, and then the animal eats the plant, right? And then the animal assimilates the proteins in the plant. Yes, plants have protein. The animal will take those proteins, build skeletal muscles and all kinds of things. The plant and the animal might urinate, defecate, or die and decompose. Now, once the animal dies, decomposes, that nitrogen can be re-released through a process known as ammonification. Now, why do we call it ammonification? Well, what do you think it forms? It forms ammonia or ammonium. And then this ammonia can then be broken down or changed form through a process known as nitrification. Again, bacteria are busy working for us to create forms of nitrogen that plants can then assimilate. So you realize that, without bacteria, we'd be in a lot of trouble, right? The nitrogen cycle is driven predominantly by microbes, microorganisms, bacteria that live in the soil. Now, sometimes excess nitrogen builds up in the soil, and too much of anything can be problematic. So how does the nitrogen get out of the soil? How does the nitrogen get out of the water or the aquatic ecosystem and back into the air? Well, you guessed it. Bacteria do what is known as denitrification, right? They break down some of these nitrogenous compounds and they re-release diatomic nitrogen into the atmosphere. And when I said wetlands are really good at purifying water, well, they're really good at purifying water because they house or contain lots of denitrifying bacteria. Denitrifying bacteria, or the bacteria that perform this process, they really like anaerobic environments that don't have a lot of oxygen. And you can imagine soil in a wetland that's completely saturated in water, there's probably not a lot of oxygen in the soil. So these bacteria break down the nitrogen as a way of getting oxygen and thankfully release that excess nitrogen into the atmosphere. Now, some atmospheric nitrogen can end up in the soil through lightning. Lightning is incredibly powerful. And so during a thunderstorm, right, you have a crack of lightning, and that lightning, which is, really energetic, hotter than the surface of the sun. Yeah. It can break these triple bonds, and these nitrogens are now free to dance with anybody. Sometimes they bind to oxygen, sometimes to hydrogen, and they can form nitrite, nitrate, and ammonia, and they can actually fall with the rainwater. And that's why thunderstorms are usually celebrated storms for most farmers and gardeners, because that rain from a thunderstorm is actually going to bring nitrogen into the soil, right? It's a type of abiotic nitrogen fixation. Now you're thinking, whoa, there's so much vocab here. And that's why I made this slide. I made this slide to kind of break down some of the vocabulary terms. Nitrogen fixation can be biotic or abiotic. Biotic nitrogen fixation, right, means living things are doing it. This is when bacteria convert diatomic nitrogen into ammonia or into NOx. You're thinking, what the heck is NOx? Well, I took some scientific liberties here, if you will. And by using this little X, it's like a variable. This represents nitrite or nitrate. So both of these things can be formed through nitrogen fixation. And bacteria accomplish this with a crazy enzyme. And I love enzymes. And those of you in my biology class know how much I like to talk about enzymes. It's just really neat. And then you can also have lightning and combustion, right? So lightning can also form ammonia or NOx, right? The X just represents a variable. It could be the 2 or 3. Now, once we form ammonia, which is not really necessarily a preferred form for plants. I mean, plants can assimilate it, but they much prefer nitrates. It can be nitrified, right? So nitrification is an aerobic process, so it does require oxygen. Plants take ammonia, which ammonia, once it uh, you know is formed, it tends to react with a hydrogen ion and tends to exist in nature as ammonium. And you just need to know that ammonia and ammonium are more or less the same thing. Once ammonia and ammonium are in the soil, certain bacteria can convert it into nitrite. And then a different species or different type of bacteria will then further convert nitrite into nitrate. And then this can be easily assimilated or absorbed by plants. And assimilation is different than absorbing. Sponges absorb water, but the sponge doesn't make water a part of its structure, right? It's just simply absorbing the water in a void in space. When plants absorb nitrogen containing compounds through their roots, they assimilate them. They actually take these inorganic, and inorganic simply means compounds that lack carbon. There's no carbons here. These inorganic forms of ammonia and nitrite and nitrate are assimilated. In other words, they are literally chemically converted into amino acids, right, which are organic forms of nitrogen to make proteins, or they can be used to make nucleic acids. Now, once the plant is eaten or dies and decomposes, decomposers, it can be fungus, but a lot of bacteria, again, can convert these nitrogenous compounds, proteins, and nucleic acids back into simple nitrogen-containing molecules. So when we die and we decompose, and you shouldn't put yourself in a coffin because nature needs those nutrients, right? There's actually a company out there that'll actually cremate you, and it'll mix your ashes with some soil and plant a tree, which I think we should all do. And so when we die and we decompose, our proteins and our nucleic acids break back down into ammonia, right? And then it becomes ammonium. And then, all these processes can happen again, right? So death and decomposition is like way in which we return nitrogen to the soil. Now, like I said before, eventually we can get really excessive amounts of nitrogen in the soil or in water, especially water. Lots of nitrogen in the water is not a good thing. We'll get algal blooms and something known as blue baby syndrome if you were to drink it. We'll talk about that later. How do we get it out? That's denitrification. Again, microbes, bacteria in the water or in this anaerobic environment will break down these nitrogenous compounds and re-release it into the atmosphere. And we actually use this in wastewater treatment facilities. We'll talk more about that later on. So you'll realize that this is kind of complicated, right? And it's going to take some time for you to really wrap your mind around it. But I promise you will get to a point where I'll say, all right, I want you to draw a diagram or a schematic of the nitrogen cycle, and you'd be able to draw something like this. But it takes time and it takes effort. The first thing I would do is I would work on studying the vocabulary, okay, that I had outlined on the previous slide. Okay, because once you kind of realize what these words mean, it can then be easier to start to create these schematics. Now, I like this because I like pictures, but the pictures can be kind of overwhelming, right? So start with the vocab and then start to kind of put these pieces together, right? Without the pictures, then you can go back and have the pictures. Now, it's important to understand the nitrogen cycle as well as the carbon cycle, because again, we talked about earlier with the carbon cycle, you got problems with ocean acidification, greenhouse gases. But with nitrogen, nitrogen is a limiting factor. Plants need nitrogen big time, right? It limits their growth. If they don't get enough nitrogen, they're not going to grow. But too much of something good can be bad, and not enough of something good can be bad, right? So the amount of nitrogen present in an ecosystem can have a significant impact on productivity, right? And so it's important for us to understand these processes because we have definitely messed with them, right? And we've also used our understanding for beneficial ways, but that can also still be problematic, like fertilizers, right? We figured out how to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and to chemically fix it into a form that we can give to plants to grow. Yay, we end world famine, but we use fertilizers so much, we've kind of grown dependent on them that we're using too much, an excessive amount of nitrogen. And we'll talk about the problems associated with that later. So again, tomorrow or tonight, it's going to snow. Yay. And so tomorrow morning, in place of our regular Zoom, I want you to go out in nature and I want you to make some observations. And when you're all good and tired from sledding and soaking wet and muddy and you come back inside, there will be two AP daily videos for you to watch in place of our Zoom. And I'm going to send you guys some like practice questions to kind of look over to help you navigate the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle. Obviously, I'll be available for, Q&A if you need. And then you'll need to make sure to complete your reading tomorrow and your TQ, which addresses the nitrogen cycle. Okay. So yeah, I'll be posting some information for you guys in the Remind and in the Google Classroom tomorrow. But let's keep our fingers crossed for some nice, fluffy, beautiful snow. Does anyone have any questions before we? All right. Well, I will talk to you guys tomorrow.